Thank you so much, Vincent. Thanks to HWOK as well and the CFPR for hosting me here, and it's a real pleasure for me to be able to present what is, yes, a preview of a book which I have just sent the final proofs. So enjoy the presentation. Please don't tell me if I've made any mistakes because it's too late. So it's a book which is covering immense amount of ground and two countries. But I try to condense all the key portions instead of trying to drop any particular portion. But I will just dive right into it. It's a book that will attempt to answer 5 questions. What is affirmative action? That's more conceptually. Why do it? How did it come about? So they're focusing on 2 countries now. How they've implemented it. Look at the outcomes, and then prospects. Where do the countries go from here? I have interspersed with this presentation with some visuals and pictures to celebrate the beauty of these countries, also to give you some relief from the dry and heavy-going content. But this one here, right, is capturing the diversity of the culture and also but also the commonalities in terms of the aspirations. And South Africa, Rainbow Nation, Malaysia, Bangsa, Malaysia, Malaysian nation, this sort of unity, diversity, right? Just a brief snapshot. And the affirmative action, is striving as well to play a role within, countries that are diverse and that are striving for this unity, diversity, and these ideals. Defining and contextualizing. This is really important because a lot of the literature, a lot of discourse, just really plunges in without setting some kind of common ground. And so that's what I want to do first. And based on literature and also some kind of mindfulness toward the Malaysia and South Africa scenario, this is the definition that I have arrived at. Affirmative action refers to preferential measures to increase the representation of a disadvantaged group, could be by race, ethnicity, gender, and so on, in socially esteemed and economically influential positions, specifically higher education, high-level occupations, enterprise, and ownership. All right, just try to ingrain that, and it will be reinforced. But that's the specific objective and definition and scope. Malaysia and South Africa stand out because they have a politically dominant but economically disadvantaged majority group, right? The Bumiputras in Malaysia, blacks in South Africa. And so there is a very strong constitutional mandate. There are political imperatives driving affirmative action and socio-economic disparities as well. Now, this also comes with challenges and pitfalls. So it's a very complex thing. But we need to build up from what its objectives are, why it, how it came about, and address the critique, right, without losing track of the policies, underpinnings, and its objectives. Let me just unpack that a little bit further, right? Because there is a political imperative, I think there's also an academic imperative to be clear, to be systematic, what it is and also what it is not. So again, the underlying problem, its principal problem that's being addressed is underrepresentation in these particular spheres listed there, okay? Underrepresentation there, it's not principally about overrepresentation among the poor or unemployed. And those are very, very important problems that need to be addressed, but they're not the principal issue here, okay? Now, what is key also, and this tends to be overlooked, especially I think in the Malaysia discourses, why the need for these specific sectors to be targeted for special intervention, because there are these barriers to entry. Grades for university, a degree to be a professional, work experience to be in top management, and so on. And that is integral to the point number 2, the instrument, right? So preferential measures are a key defining feature, because to facilitate the progress, and there is a political dimension, a social, whereby the expectation and the imperative is not just for some change to happen, but the change to be facilitated, to be accelerated, right? To be promoted. that to overcome those barriers, right, calls for some element of preferential treatment, which is based on identity, in this case, race. So it's again not principally about class or low income or socio-economic disadvantage, not systemically, not as a whole. Also related to this, okay, and this is addressing some of the interrelated issues and the contentions. Prohibiting discrimination, equal opportunity are important but are not enough to effect the desired change of increasing the upward mobility and the representation of the disadvantaged group. There are those pitfalls, and of course it's important to address them, but the ultimate objective is not to overcome patronage or corruption. The ultimate objective is not so much about poverty alleviation, it's about developing the capability, the competitiveness, because yes, and here it's a bit of a normative position that I believe, and I think many do, that it's not something that is meant to be permanent, it's meant to be transitional or temporary. But how do you make it actually temporary is by addressing the majority group, the beneficiary, capability, competitiveness, and confidence. Those are the prerequisites for actually graduating out of overt racial preference. I want to address this because it also does come up, because one of the critiques, and there is sort of this quite actually a mainstream view in Malaysia that, oh, we should just do need-based policies or merit-based, and these should replace race-based affirmative action. I want to be very clear that they can play a role in complementing or reinforcing affirmative action, but they cannot substitute the whole system of a race-based affirmative action. And also, we have to be very, very specific in how they apply, because it's different in the different policy sectors. So you think of need-based, meaning, principally helping the poor instead of helping a particular race group. I think that reform or that shift can take place, especially in higher education. But there are other spheres of affirmative action, and they don't really apply there. So you can't really do a need-based, like a pro-poor alternative to race-based affirmative action when it comes to enterprise development. In that case, you need to select beneficiaries of contracts and loans and so on based on ability and potential. You can impose limits, but you cannot go about that by saying, let's give more loans to the poor in the hope of there will be, these champion Bumiputera or Black enterprises, right? So just to give this very, very brief survey, I think you have some idea about this majority group and where these two countries stand. Okay, so they are selected because they're both large countries, they're quite urbanized, they're not the only majority favoring. Right, you have here a snapshot of the racial and ethnic composition. And do note that the Bumiputera, there's Malay and non-Malay within that. So Bumiputera, it is an artificial category. I am using the categories that both countries apply. And then within Black as well in South Africa, the African, colored, and Indian. I will apply them, although I know there are, there's debates about that. Both countries are also upper middle income, they're diversified economies, so that they're quite advanced in education and industrial sectors. So there's also a lot that is at stake of opportunities to be redistributed. So let's take a bit of the mountaintop first and consider how did affirmative action come about in these two countries. And I just want to distill that into three main key elements of the regime. And I call it a regime because it is, right, a whole system of many, many different programs, again, in the four main areas that I've highlighted. So Malaysia and South Africa really do stand out internationally because the constitutions do provide for affirmative action, but there are very key differences here. In Malaysia, the premise is articulated as the special position of the Bumiputeras. It's in Article 153. In South Africa, it is articulated in the Constitution as the disadvantage due to unfair discrimination. That's the broad one in Article 9. Article 195 related to the public services. It establishes that it should be broadly representative. Now, these do have implications on how the policies will look as we see later. The affirmative action emerges, right, in both countries in a time of transition, a time of flux and crises, sort of many things all wrapped into one. So here I'm talking about 1970s, although from 1957 they were in place in the constitution, but from 1971 with the new economic policy, they massively expand. And it's in the context politically and socially whereby there is firstly Malay continuous Malay power. So there's no transition of shifting power from one group to another or one party to another. There is a reassertion of Malay primacy in terms of policy, in terms of identity and culture and so on. There's also consolidation of executive dominance from the 1970s. I'm really simplifying, but here's the contrast, right? In South Africa, you have a shift in the 1990s from white apartheid minority rule to the democratic black majority rule. And so that's going to have an impact on how the system looks and how the policies will roll out. It also democratizes in the 90s, and there's an emphasis on autonomy. Right. There's so many other things as well. It was a country that was really trying to even avoid, try to stay together and avoid civil war. So there were many or falling apart, right? And so there was a lot of strife. And so again, that is shaping how the policies will look. The magnitude of the disparity also has an impact on how on the affirmative action regime. So Bumiputras were not dominant in all sectors. There was a large foreign presence in Malaysia, and as well, the Malay dominance in the bureaucracy was continuous. In contrast, in South Africa, the white dominance was comprehensive. It was comprehensive in economics, in politics, in every sphere, right? In the public and the private sectors. And as well, you see that the emergence of very robust actions in employment, I think that derives from the discrimination, systematic discrimination in the labor market. It had a tiered education system as well. Okay. So the magnitude of disparity also matters, and so that's the background for, I think, three important areas of contrast. In the orientation, Malaysia's program is more driven by executive authority. The executive decides, doesn't bother with passing laws and codes and so on, whereas South Africa followed a more legislative statutory process. Malaysia is more centralized. An example is the public universities admissions system is centralized. South Africa is more relatively decentralized, and universities have autonomy in admissions. In terms of the mode, Malaysia's quotas and reservations. Reservation is actually the word in the constitution. It's more based on that, relatively, and there are more exclusive Bumiputra programs in microfinance, in unit trust, and so on. Whereas South Africa has kind of reverted to more of a model, gravitated more towards codified system. We have codes of conduct. It's more target-oriented than quota per se. Of course, the two are interrelated. And there's less extensive the black exclusive programs. So I hope you get a sense of some of the contrast, which is important just to know about the countries, but also to, as context for thinking about whether the lessons can be transferred from one country to the other, right? How has it been implemented? So let me flesh out a little bit more. And you can, I think, begin to see more the contrast here in the four sectors. So in higher education, Malaysia, there are reservations of quotas in pre-university, residential schools, in government scholarships. Now, there is this official meritocracy in the centralized university admissions, right? But which means that, okay, if you apply, only look at grades and not at, ethnic identity. But there is still a preferential element because pre-university, in what they call the matriculation colleges especially, there is a 90% Bumiputra quota, right? So it's a bit of an illusory meritocracy. Mara runs technical colleges, universities. Those are exclusively Bumiputera. In South Africa, it had a few layers of challenge. First was to close the gap between what we call historically white institutions and historically black institutions. So that's more between institutions. In terms of admissions into the universities have the autonomy to devise their own what they call transformation or redress policies. And I just want to note that there has been a systematic adoption of disadvantage as a criteria, so not just about race, right? And financial assistance does operate on the basis of some means-tested system. In the area of promoting advancements to high-level occupations, in Malaysia, this one is more of a striking contrast, because Malaysia it operates really in a more de facto manner. It's nothing is really very formalized, but the preference in the public sector and government companies is quite clear. South Africa's Employment Equity Act in 1998, right, is one of the cornerstones of affirmative action in South Africa, and it applies to both the public sector and to a medium and large-scale private sector. The companies have to report on their workforce composition, and they're supposed to consult with workers, devise an employment equity plan, set employment equity targets, which involve increasing representation of suitably qualified persons from the historically disadvantaged groups. And they need to file employment equity reports with the Commission for Employment Equity. So it's really quite an extensive intervention. And again, through a legislative and a codified process. There's a lot that have been done in both countries for enterprise development. And Malaysia went through various phases. You can read them there. I just want to highlight that in the 1980s, the privatization, this was probably, one of the world's most massive privatizations, which ended with the Asian financial crisis. A lot of them, collapsed, and they had to be renationalized. Since then, the government-linked companies have played a lead role, right? In the public procurement, there's quotas, there are price handicaps as well, licensing and public procurement, SME loans and support. Let me touch on the microfinance. A lot of these I just want to mention here because they do operate behind the scenes, and a lot of people are not aware that they exist, right? And so the outreach really is very extensive. The Bumiputera Economic Transformation Program from about 2011, and now it's called Bumiputera Economic Community. I think it was not just a rehash of what was done before. I think there is a emphasis on independent, competitive Bumiputera enterprises. It's experimented with a few measures, but it's not been a very systematic or systemic-wide, it hasn't brought about systemic-wide change. South Africa, you see again, there's an act there, the BEE Act, Broad-Based Economic Empowerment, and that authorized these codes of good practice. So it's a scoring system where companies that want to participate in procurement, licensing, or PPPs, or acquire state assets, need to be audited for scores with along these lines, with these criteria: ownership, management, skill development, and then providing support to suppliers and smaller enterprises. One of the, I think, most striking to me similarities is actually the Malaysia's government-linked companies and the state-owned companies of South Africa. They're both government-owned and have a important role for directly employing blacks in management, in CEO positions, and in supplier development. You also have loans and support in South Africa with Industrial Development Corporation, SME funding, and I highlight that one. I'll say more later. I think the Black Industrialist Program, it's a newer one, which is more directly providing credit and trying to develop black-owned enterprise rather than transferring previously white majority-owned. Wealth ownership, Malaysia has more going here. There's the unit trust schemes, Amanah Saham. There's property purchase quotas and discounts. The entry requirements for equity requirements for IPOs. South Africa, they do have, I think it's quite major, but I think still not on the scale of Malaysia, or with equity transfers under the BBEE, and what are industry charters, which is within an industry sort of, a plan, right, for transforming. I think this is of course the main objective. Mostly what we've done is set up, although it's important to know what are the programs, to know where they come from, right? But yeah, this is the empirical inquiry that wants to also examine what has affirmative action achieved. There's actually not very much that is written on each of the countries, or on and less so comparatively. A little bit surprising, and by that I mean studies that are actually focused on these affirmative action objectives and their direct outcomes. There's a lot of literature that is more cast the problem more broadly about inequality, especially interracial household income inequality, and then extrapolates from there on to affirmative action, but not in a direct way about what is affirmative action, and not in a very convincing way as well, I think. So there was really not much to draw on, but the most helpful reference I found was a study on the United States and India by Weizkopf. And what he did there was to conduct a multidimensional cost-benefit analysis. So not narrowing everything down to inter-ethnic income inequality, for instance, and one measure, but multiple indicators and data sources. But it's very country specific as well, and inquiry specific. So and his was on only higher education. My approach here in the book is to focus on all the policy sectors, the four main ones, and to cover the quantitative and, as much as possible, qualitative outcomes as well. So qualitative, quantitative, like enrollment, just the numbers. Qualitative, well, the achievement, and graduates' employability and mobility captured, right, in that way. There are constraints due to data, so as much as possible, try to refer to data, where we could juxtapose the two countries. But obviously, there are going to be limitations. So I'm just going to go through. I've pulled the the ones that I think can be presented right in a macro picture, like this, and then give a few thoughts on that. So we go through the four here first with higher education in Malaysia. This is the labor force, the share of the labor force with tertiary education, and it's very obvious that it's moving up for all the groups. Okay, that the Bumiputras, it's the black line a bit concealed here, but I think you can see. But also within the Bumiputra, right, there is a disparity between the Malay. So this is the certification, the share of the labor force that hold tertiary, diploma, degree level, and it is highest for Malays, even more than the Chinese. But within the Bumiputra, Malay and non-Malay, and especially they are in Sabah and Sarawak, there's a lag there. There's not showing in this chart, of course, but concerns of the quality of graduates, higher Bumiputra unemployment, more dependent on the public sector. So, there are issues to be discussed there, and it's a mixed picture with clear quantitative outcomes, but certain problems when you probe a little bit more from a qualitative angle. South Africa's higher education. This is the and I should note, you will see in due course that data is a lot more accessible in South Africa. This is the public universities, the enrollment, and what we can see here, the steady advancement okay, of blacks into higher education. This is split into the four main official categories. But the share of enrollment is higher than the share of graduates. You know, that is to be expected, but it's also showing that it's a challenge, ongoing challenge. And again, not revealed here. When you look at, you know, graduate tracer studies and primary and school graduate kind of information, the disparities from the schooling system, right, are still very, very stark, and they do extend to higher education in the form of, I mean, it can be observed, right, in the form of lower graduation rates among black students and so on. And if you look at fields of study, there are disparities. And a bit troubling, okay, is a decline in African students, the share of science, engineering, and technology students. The second main policy sector of high-level occupations in Malaysia. Now, this is showing the Bumiputra as a share of those positions, managerial, professional, technical positions. And this is going all the way back to 1970, where we can see that, yes, there is also the steady progress, but it has slowed down. Now, it's going to reach a certain, of course, natural limit of the proportion of the population. And here there's also issues with reclassification of jobs. But you look at managers, right? It's something that is just, progress is not really, it's, you know, not really progressing, has not really progressed like on a very robust pace lately, and it's still conspicuously lower, the share of managers. And a larger proportion of the Bumiputra's professionals and managers are in the public sector and government-linked companies. In South Africa, this is the labor force survey, so it is kind of national coverage, and this snapshot over time is showing some steady progress, right? It's showing, and this is, I think, the backbone for growth of a black middle class. But I think when we break down, which we actually will get to later. Oh yeah, no, here with break it down further, because the aggregated labor force data management, you know, is all lumped together, professionals as well. So the employment equity reports furnish some data that we can actually disaggregate top management and senior, and here what I report here with professional and middle management. And you see the progress for black representation in top management, right? Is persistently, the levels are persistently low, the progress is much slower. But this is also still reflecting the employment equity in progress, because the recruitment and promotion, the levels are higher than in employment. So there's more blacks are being promoted, but not quite yet at the top position, holding the top management positions. Employment equity is you know, there's a polarized debate about it, which I don't think I can really get into. But you know, there's some parties saying it's going too slowly. Private sector is not supportive enough. There can be some evidence to back that, and then some are would rebut that it's being actually pushed too fast. There's skills shortages, and then there's the issue of brain drain. You know, there are, this is a very ongoing, right, and a very vigorous debate, which I just have to mention it here, and we can discuss that later. But I think the trend in terms of the representation is showing that it's slow and steady progress, and mainly concentrated in the public sector. So here, back to the labor force survey, in which we can make the distinction, is showing that yes, the black representation for management and professionals is higher in the public sector, the upper two lines, than in the private sector. It has come with a few attendant issues as well. How the public sector is structured. It South Africa adopted this managerialism, or I think the formal term of new public management, where management posts expanded as a share, and so that contributed as well to black representation in managerial positions in the public sector. But it also led to public service delivery, or it's been associated with public service delivery problems. And I think one issue that's a bit more distinctly problematic. Many of the issues are, are debatable, but I think perhaps less so, or more, more clearly problematic was a policy of ANC's cadre deployment, of positioning, party cadre in positions in the public sector. So there's that element of the politicization, but it's one of many other issues that are associated with employment equity. In enterprise development, I want to draw out a few that I think are highlighting both the progress as well as the challenges. And this first one is that after all these years in Malaysia, major shortcoming is in Bumiputra owned companies that the high concentration that are very small and still not really making much breakthrough, or not enough breakthrough in achieving the medium level. So you can see here the contrast between Bumiputra owned and non-Bumiputra owned. South Africa here, there was this fragment of data that I managed to get in a publication, which is painting a similar picture in that there is also a concentration of African-owned enterprise at the micro scale and less represented at the medium scale. The GLCs and state-owned companies, Malaysia GLCs underwent a transformation program. The top ones, right, have, I think, improved on their commercial and financial performance, but it's a massive sector as well, and I think it's questionable whether, as a whole, how successful it is. But certainly for the very big, or the top 20, I think there's been improvements that can be documented. But there's been challenges in the Bumiputra vendor development within the GLCs. In South Africa, I think it's a similar overarching story about, there's been, they play an important role, a signaling role, but I think more challenges are there in its state-owned companies, which I think I'll just move on, although there could be more to say there. Directorships of publicly listed companies. Malaysia, just very recently, there was this survey of the 100 largest KLSE listed corporations, and the share of Malay and Chinese was actually, or Malaysia had reached 41%, almost on par with Chinese. And I think a key factor here is the government-linked companies, and which have been talking about already how central they are in Malaysia. The shares in South Africa are much lower, the numbers that you can see there. Okay. I know the time is catching up, so I'll breeze through this, and then I'll just skip to my concluding slides. In wealth ownership, Malaysia here has more, has reported more. They've tracked this, and it's actually been a little bit of an inordinate obsession. But the target that Malaysia had set of 30% way back in 1971. So the numbers are showing that continuously we have fallen short, right? But in 1971, the NEP's original target had twofold. There were individual targets and institutional targets. And the individual target of 7.4% was actually achieved by 1985. So what I try to do here, with this revelation, is I think to have a different angle on it. And I think it's probably time to really park this issue, but we can even say that Malaysia has achieved one element of it. South Africa, the statistics are heavily contested, as they also are in Malaysia, but South Africa doesn't have this sort of long official series of equity ownership statistics. And But just to give a flavor, it's definite, regardless of which estimate, right? It's very low. There was in 2015 this debate where the presidency released a figure of 3%. The stock exchange claimed it was higher at 10% direct and 13% indirect. But either way, right, it's very low. So let me just conclude with the policy implications, and I think it's implied what the policy outcomes are. As I had emphasized, there's a need to adopt this systematic and sector-specific framework, which I think is lacking in both countries, to pay more attention to the disparities within the beneficiary group. The driving focus needs to be on capability, on competitiveness. That is ultimately what matters for the policies, right, to achieve their objective, the ultimate objective, that you could actually roll back that overt preferential treatment. And in line with that, with the emphasis on sector-specific framework, is that the timelines, the milestones as well, need to be sector-specific. That is, not to have the whole system, not plan just to have the whole system exist and then suddenly everything also goes all at once. I think Malaysia can decentralize a little bit more in here, draw a bit more on South Africa's practices in higher education to systematically incorporate disadvantage and diversity, right? To focus on capability and academic ability, and not be deluded with its illusory meritocracy in place. South Africa's basic school deficiencies, I think it's beyond affirmative action in a way, but it needs to be put here as a major ingredient going forward. And I think continuing to innovate the way that it does university admissions. I think Malaysia can consider fair employment legislation, not employment equity, but it's kind of as in South Africa, but something customized to Malaysia's constraints, its needs, and its history. South Africa's employment equity, right, is really embedded. It's been constitutionally upheld. But I think progressing at a measured pace, moderated targets integrated with higher education, supply of graduates would be a positive step forward. In enterprise development, I think Malaysia, it's just perennially underachieved. In public procurement, the disincentive, there's actually disincentive to grow. Right, so it will need to really address these deficiencies a lot more vigorously, and especially to focus on medium-scale enterprises. And that should be the main data, right? The main indicator, the main objective that's being tracked, not equity distribution. South Africa's triple BEE is also like employment equity, quite firmly planted. I think it can be fine-tuned, especially by focusing on more productive aspects and not just transfer of ownership and equity and more acquisitive aspects. And the Black Industrialist program, which is is a newer one. I think that does hold promise, subject to how it is executed, because it is directed at manufacturing, is directed at more new and Black-owned companies. In wealth ownership, I think Malaysia, go back to the original NEP target and settle some things there, that the individual targets have been achieved. Yeah, maybe there's some room as well to look at the institutional side. I want to highlight here, and I've put that in bold, property discounts for medium and high income Bumiputras. That's a distinct case for policy graduation. That is, you can, you decommission something because it has actually, the community has achieved, sufficient empowerment that it can do without it, right? And I think just the closing line then, because it follows on that, going back to the point about how, yes, in principle, ideally, this is an intervention that's meant to be temporary. But how do we actually make that temporary, right? Is by helping it succeed. It needs to be effective, right? It has promoted access and participation, but in both countries still fallen short in developing capability, right? And so this is kind of addressing the issue, some of the debate, which I think gets sidetracked a little bit because it focuses on, oh, is it helping the poor, or there's corruption, there's patronage. Ultimately, though, it has to come back to this. To succeed at promoting the capability, the confidence, the competitiveness of the beneficiary group, because the majority will need to be sufficiently empowered. They need to graduate out of overt racial preference. It won't end by just declaring failure and abandoning, but by actually achieving being successful at its original and ultimate objective. So I think I'll conclude there. Thank you so much for bearing with me. And I know there's a lot more to contemplate. I look forward to your questions. Yeah, whether you like to contemplate like this buffalo immersed in a bath or to take a long walk in the hills. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, HWOK An. I do have some questions, but I'm looking at the clock and I think it's better to open the discussion to the floor. So any takers, questions for HWOK An? Questions, feel free to unmute and just ask.
Yeah, this is Ma Hui. Can I ask?
Yes, Ma.
I think everyone agrees with you about the objectives in terms of increasing the capabilities, competitiveness, and confidence of the groups that have been kind of left behind a bit. But it seems to me that the policies that are used to achieve these objectives don't actually, as you rightly say, don't lead to those objectives. It undermines it. For example, relaxing standards for passing exams and all this stuff. Yeah, you're right that it has to be done, but if a population is so used to it, and any attempt to change it would be politically resisted. So how do you get out of that kind of conundrum?
We'll just address them as they come.
Yep.
Yeah. Well, yeah, everyone would agree when like in response to someone saying it, as I have just said. But actually, I disagree but in that there is in Malaysia, this stranglehold, a certain consensus that Malaysia, that we can just do need-based, for instance. And and by doing that, they have just gotten sidetracked. It's no more about capability or competitiveness. They're focusing on, oh, how is it helping the poor? And then posing, I think, all kinds of muddled, incoherent alternatives, right? Like and never really ever providing policy specifics. Actually, I find in the Malaysian case. So. Okay, but to your question, the politics of it, I think what needs to start is people actually need to say it. I mean, when was the last time a Malaysian was saying something like this, that the NEP, its ultimate objective was actually about capability? We focus on, oh, what's the equity distribution? Or again, how is it helping the poor? And which you can apply to higher education to some extent, but right, again, it has all kinds of problems and perils if you try to apply it to enterprise development, to a higher level, to upward mobility occupations, and so on. So I think, politically there needs to be clarity, right? Which then sets up for some of the the difficult decisions and challenges that need to take place. So, see, the constraint, to take an example of education, right, is that yes, it will, the government, right, wants to safeguard the accessibility of higher education, especially for the Bumiputras and the Malays. So any policy, right, that will imperil the the proportion of Bumiputras in a higher education is going to be politically very, very dicey. You need to come up again, but I think by saying that what is our ultimate objective, we need to promote the capability, not just the access, right? And then proceed by doing things which I think actually can be done. So the matriculation colleges, you have this transition between secondary school and university, where as an opportunity, I think that you can close the gaps, because students do come from all kinds of different secondary school backgrounds. But instead of doing that, the matriculation colleges, and again, because they have only focused on just providing the access rather than focusing on the academic achievement and preparedness for university, it's a fast-track system with a diluted syllabus. So it under-equips students to go to, to university. And then that's kind of compounded because it's under the guise of meritocracy. So there's a bit of this illusion, which people then also feel that, oh, we are actually on the level. It's a level playing field, and it's the rhetoric is quite surely quite empowering, but it's also a bit self-deceiving. It needs to undertake that kind of, I think, step by step. But I would disagree that the rhetoric, and even in society, even in academia in Malaysia, the approach to affirmative action, I don't think, has this kind of method and a progression. That we want to develop capability. Ultimately, that's the most important thing. And therefore, you plan, and you analyze what needs to take place in that direction. Right? There's a lot of focus on where it has gone wrong, on the how the benefits, right, have trickled up to the elite, which are problems, undoubtedly, right? But yeah, the discourse is kind of really just all over the place, and I think a bit too reactive to the problems that we see.
Other questions from other participants?
Yes.
Yes.
Hi.
Husu, yes.
Hi, Husu here. Dr. Lee, thank you for your informative talk. I learned a lot. My first question is about the role of the geopolitical and historical context in shaping the differences between the affirmative action regimes between South Africa and Malaysia. So, like for example, in Malaysia, the privileged minority, the Chinese group, were not part of the colonizers, but in South Africa, the white population were actually perceived as part of the colonizers. So I'm wondering these geopolitical historical factors, the role these factors play in shaping the affirmative action regime. And my second question is, I'm curious as to how do the different ethnic minority groups react to these affirmative action policies and laws? So yeah, just one, these two questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Husu. Håkan?
Yes, very, very, very good question. Well, okay, so South Africa, as you pointed out, yes, it came out of apartheid, and even before that, many centuries, where you had a minority, right, subordinating the majority. So and that is a very, very fundamental difference between what happens in Malaysia. And so if you go back to thinking about the Employment Equity Act, it is most striking illustration. I mean, overall, others as well. But what it is most striking about is the moral imperative. You go back to the Constitution, the grounds were previously disadvantaged. So it is referring back to a system in which there was that inequality that is trying to turn around, right? And it is because there is this moral imperative moral case or whatever underpinnings for restitution, right? For recompense for past wrongs between the people in the same country. And I think that has, yes, given the legitimacy, okay, given certainly the force to certain interventions in South Africa that are absent in Malaysia. In the Employment Equity Act, it applies to the public sector and the private sector. Malaysia's employment policies largely are, are very minimal on the private sector, at least formally. I mean, if you're publicly listed, you might get some attention. If you're contract, participating in procurement, yes, but nothing like the Employment Equity Act of South Africa, right? Because again, yes, it was there was some element of restitution, right, of correcting past wrongs. The minority groups, I think there's similarities in that. I mean, I think both countries you have well established, right, minorities, and in South Africa even longer, right? Even though they're smaller minority, or we're talking about the white population of 8% now, I think, that some have been in there for centuries. Yeah, there's a great sense of ownership over the country, right? And a strong sentiments towards the country. And I think that goes as well with a certain, yeah, there are certain grievances, there are certain concerns about the opportunities for them, about the repercussions of affirmative action on the minorities. But it's again, right, yeah, you would have heterogeneity within the group, and there are some that are also have accommodated, right, or have an understanding about how, right, the balances and the compromises that the country has struck. The ways that they come about, yeah.
Sorry, any other questions from other participants?
Hi, I have a question which follows up on the first question, just a quick one. So I just want to push you a bit more about the conclusion that you made. Thank you for the presentation, by the way. So the assumption here is that by achieving the objectives laid out in the affirmative action policies, the overt racial preferences will it will be moved away from. So my question would be, is this really so? Because one could formulate that even by achieving the affirmative action policies, the overt racial preferences would still exist. And I would argue this case because of the existence of the politically dominant majority in the first place. And especially in the Malaysia case, you have the narrative of Ketuanan Melayu, and like the fact that certain groups see Malay political dominance as being paramount, right? Regardless of whether Malays achieve a certain set of socioeconomic outcomes or not. So I guess my question would be, how would you argue stronger for the implication that achieving affirmative action would lead to the removal of overt racial preferences? Thank you.
Great, excellent question. I'm not saying that it will. I'm saying that that is the prerequisite. That is fundamentally the most important thing that needs to happen, right? Ask this question: under which scenario is affirmative action more likely? And this is aspirational also. I'm not saying that, again, right, that there's a clear causality and that sort of deterministically this happens and then it will happen, right? But which is more likely to, under which scenario will, certain rollback? Sorry, and I'm sorry I'm going off on tangent again, but when I say also that sort of this, the conclusion, or when it's sort of this for affirmative action, right, to be rolled back, I'm not saying that it's totally abolished, or that societies then, it doesn't matter, the issue of ethnic and group representation doesn't matter. But this particular mode that we're operating right now with overt preference, with quotas, right, will be rolled back, and maybe you can try to strive for diversity through other means, okay? But which is more likely, under which scenario would that be more likely for Malaysia to roll back these quotas, the overt preferences? When the majority group say that we are sufficiently empowered, we don't need it anymore, or when the minority group says that we can't take it anymore? I mean, both are hypothetical, but which is more likely? To me, it's when the majority group, right, will say, and it will take it will take a Herculean effort politically and socially for some forces to galvanize around, around this. So I'm saying this with absolutely no certainty it will happen. But between that and hoping that as long as the minorities and a smattering of the majority, because there are a few Malays as well that will say that, look, let's get rid of it, to hope that it will actually, right, be phased out because the minorities complain. I don't think it's going to pan out that way. It will have to be focused. It will have to be driven by the majority, and the majority will need to really feel that yes, we have the capability, we have the confidence, we are competitive. Right?
Yeah. Thank you, Hok An. I have a question here from Ryan. Ryan, do you want to pose your question to Hok An? Yeah.
Yes, sure. Hi, Dr. Lee. So thanks for the presentation. I wanted to ask in regards to, since given that there's this majority sort of thing in Malaysia, in that sense, that how would that affect the minorities if, given that current political situation says it's a Malay pro-Malay Bumiputera coalition, how would that then lead to then more brain drain in that sense, from among the minorities? And also a second part to it is, it's important, like what you said, to build the capability, but how do you erase or try to diminish these stereotypes so that it's, I think, ultimately affecting how people perceive the majority race, especially in private employment, because public sector doesn't seem to be an issue affecting them as much comparatively. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, the first question, I guess, overlaps a little bit about how the impacts on the minority. Let me focus more on I guess the second one, politically. Yeah, again, I mean, I'm coming to this, right, as a policy researcher from an academic scholarship standpoint, about how the policy, how it's doing, and what is necessary for it to progress, and eventually it's meant to be something that is redundant, right? How do we actually get there? And it also doesn't, and we don't get there as well by shifting the attention to, oh, let's just help the poor. I think this is a little bit of a ploy. If you want to go after this Malay elite, okay, and so on, right? I don't get it. That there's the property discounts issue, which I had brought up, right? So again, how this, right, should the longer term, right, trajectory, the way that I see it, how it can lead to kind of its own redundancy, and then you can roll it back. It has to be when you do have the empowered people, right, that say we don't need it enough, and you actually visibly and take steps to remove the preference. When it comes to things like property discounts, right, there should be a little bit more attention and a bit more pressure, because those are the Malays that are in a position to say that we don't need it anymore, right? But I think a lot of people let them off the hook a little bit, because and then to divert it to say that, oh, let's just help the poor. Suddenly it's all about these masses that need to bear the burden of the adjustment, and not those who have actually benefited. For the minorities, well, yeah, there's very, very deep-seated emotions. The kind of view that I bring here is quite anathema. because really a lot just say we just want the system to end now. I will answer it from this angle, and which I think what a certain change of mindset, I guess, needs to take place as well in Malaysia's minority groups, to relook at the system and what is its original, and ultimate objective.
Thanks, Wokan. Sorry to interrupt, but I'm looking at the time, and I think we should be wrapping up soon. Shall we just have one last question? I have Mr. Ismula has asked a question in the chat. Mr. Ismula, would you like to pose your question to Hock An?
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yep.
So, is there any economic development in between Malaysia and South Africa since COVID-19 strikes in? And how to be achieved next time after COVID-19 pandemic? Thanks.
COVID-19, I don't really see there is much of an impact in terms of affirmative action. In fact, I think the countries have been focused on a lot more pressing issues which relate to, basic health and employment, and engage in a way that is on the basis of, treating every group equally, or every group in need offering help. So it's really not been, the situation has not called for particular action in terms of group preferential policies.
Okay, thanks so much, Hock An. I think let's call it a wrap, unless anyone has a very urgent question that they need to ask. Okay, I think we call it a day. Hock An, thank you so much for taking this time to share with us your research. I've learned a lot. It's a very rich study comparing the two societies. In Malaysia, on one hand, you have the quota system. In Africa, in South Africa, you have the scoring system. And you posed a very interesting question just now about which AA regime would be especially effective. But at the same time, Husu, one of the participants, actually asked whether historical factors actually come in to make it not so easy to just say, okay, we should be pressing this button and pressing that button, right? So there are all these confluence of factors, strategies, but at the same time, historical factors that one has to consider in comparing the two systems. So I learned a lot. I think I have to go back and think about how to work them out. So thank you very much. To the rest of the participants, thank you for taking the afternoon to be with us. I wish you well. Let's all stay healthy and safe, especially during this time. So thank you and see you again. Bye.
Thank you so much. Have a good day.
See you.